First off, I'd like to thank everyone here for coming to this event, to our last final, or at least main event, or two main events actually, entitled The Black Power Movement and the Revolution. Of course, I am Zacharias. My name is Zacharias. I'm the Black Students Officer of the Union, and I wanted to at least bring this event forward because I wanted to have a specific agenda in mind. And this specific agenda was looking at the significance, or rather the relevance of political activism and political militant radical activism related, of course, to black students. And I wanted to bring it to this university, of course, with the significance of this university being 67% BME. I wanted to have a political agenda in place so that we can actually have a means or a tool in which we can actually drive forward the goals that we want to achieve that could bring about liberation for our people, not just on this campus, but everywhere across the country and, of course, across the world. Now, I'm not going to speak too long. I don't have anything planned. Everything's just coming from my mind and my heart. But I will at least introduce bring to the podium our chair for this evening, the National Union of National Union of Students of NUS Black Students Officer, Aaron Kiley, who will be chairing this event. So I just open the floor.
Well, first of all, thank you very much, Zacharias, for inviting me to come chair this event. It's going to be fantastic, I know, and I can already tell there's going to be some excellent contributions from people in the audience, so very much look forward to it. We've got an excellent panel that are going to join us today for this, and just wanted to give a little bit of a background to the Black Students Campaign. So the Black Students Campaign is a part of the National Union of Students, and we're founded to bring together all students of African, Arab, Asian and Caribbean heritage to fight against racism and for increased black representation within the student movement. We've had many campaigns over the years. One of them was actually led by, well, this campaign has actually been led by several people from Bradford. So Kanja is my predecessor, who's in the audience. There's also been a few other people around Bradford who have been centrally involved in Bradford, and in the Black Students Campaign. That's fantastic because there's a real kind of like strength and a real history to Bradford of being progressive, radical institution with fantastic students at it, passionate about challenging racism and fighting inequality in society. So, I mean, we've been active on a few of the issues recently you must have probably heard about. So there was an attempt to ban, for example, the veil at Birmingham Metropolitan College, which we were successfully able to overturn, which is a fantastic victory and really does actually show the strength that when actually we have a movement, we can fight and we can win. We've also been central in fighting austerity, increased fees for students, loss of EMA, and also for campaigning for international peace and justice, something I know that is at the heart of many Bradford students, with fantastic societies existing here on Palestine for end to exploitation of Africa, for justice for the black majority of humanity. So it's not really about me, I'm just here to chair it, but I really do invite you to get involved in the Black Students Campaign if you haven't been already. Please go involved, come to our conferences. There's a couple of people on the committee who are here at the moment, myself, Zacharias, Adam, Piers as well from Bradford College. We've got a conference coming up on 30th of November, the 1st of December, which is in London, and you're all invited to come. And there's some materials at the front which are free, posters for Black History Month, so please do take some. Okay, so without further ado, I'm going to go to our first speaker of the evening, which is Adam Elliott Cooper, who is a student activist who has been a member of who was the BME committee member at Nottingham University. He's currently a member of the Black Students Campaign Committee. He's also worked as a writer, researcher, independent academic research studies, the Greater London Authority, Race on the Agenda, Voice of Africa Radio, the Institute of Race Relations and Free Radicals. So he's collecting all of the titles possible. So he's a very intelligent person, so I'll leave it to Adam to kick off.
Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about what the kind of situation in Britain is today around the prison industrial complex and policing, particularly in relation to black communities. And then I want to talk a little bit about what the black community organisations I've been involved with, or that I'm familiar with at least, have been doing to kind of resist a lot of these issues and create some alternatives. I've noticed that, I know that, and I'm sure a lot of people in this room were kind of involved in the recent kind of anti-EDL protests, right? Yeah, that's good. The recent anti-EDL protests. And what we had was, I think, the EDL will kind of like engage in kind of like this kind of quite overt racism. We see a lot of kind of Islamophobia, a lot of racial slurs that we're quite familiar with, and that we have quite an emotional response to, right? So we hear the kind of Islamophobic things that they say, and kind of a lot of the overt racism, and it makes us angry, and we go out and we protest and we resist that form of fascism. But I want to talk about a different type of fascism, a different sort of racism. During the 2011 riots, a few of the people that I work with are doing a lot of monitoring of the police, because the police were doing a lot of kind of harassment and they were being quite violent in a lot of our communities during this time. And at one point, they found themselves alone in a car park with the police, and they ended up being cornered by the police, put into the back of a van and beaten up quite badly by them. And as they were being beaten by the police, over and over again the police shouted the same words. They shouted, "Multiculturalism has failed, multiculturalism has failed, multiculturalism has failed." And these are the kind of slurs, and I guess they were slurs or being used as slurs, that were quite different to the kind of slurs we're perhaps used to hearing from the English Defence League and other so-called far-right organisations. And I think that's something we need to think about. I think it's something that's quite important that I'll return to. Now, the issues that we face in the UK today, particularly around policing and the state, which I think are some of the most pertinent issues, haven't really changed that much in a very, very long time. One of the most common ones that most of us are familiar with are the issues around stop and search, right? So we know that particularly black people are far more likely to be stopped and searched on the streets. They mainly search for drugs, even though, according to every single study out there, black people are no more or less likely to have drugs on them than a white person is. Similarly, arrest rates are disproportionate as well. So you've got far more disproportionate arrest rates, so a black person is more likely to be arrested if drugs are found on them, if weed is found on them, than a white person is. Similarly, they're far more likely to be charged, and the length of sentences are much longer as well. These are studies that have been done most recently by an organisation called Release, which is like a judge charity in conjunction with the London School of Economics. And the studies on the length of sentences and the incarceration rates were done recently by the Open Society Foundation. So what we're seeing is at every single juncture of the criminal justice system, we're seeing a disproportionate effect on black communities, not just at the stop and search level, but at every single stage. And I think this is really, really relevant and really important, and something that black communities have been doing a lot to kind of resist and address. There are a lot of other issues as well around education, employment and housing. I don't know if anyone saw The Guardian this morning, but they reported on a study that's just been done by the BBC, where they found that letting agents were willing to not rent to African Caribbean people in northwest London. If like a landlord said, "Look, I don't want to rent to black people," they'd be like, "Not a problem." And they described them as, they said, the quote says, "99% of my landlords don't want African Caribbeans or any other troublesome people." Similarly with education, we have huge problems with education. I know that Kanja and others have done a lot of work around this. It's something the Black Students Campaign does a lot. And I think that it's important to remember that it's not just the kind of underachievements within academia that's really, really important. It's also the underassessment that takes place. And I think a really interesting study was done by a professor called Steve Strands, who's now at Oxford University. And what he did was he looked at the SATs. Now, we all did our SATs, right, in year 6. You do your SATs in year 6, you do them in English, maths and science. And they're blind marked. So they're sent away somewhere else and they're marked somewhere else. They don't know what your name is, they don't know what you look like, they don't know what race or ethnicity you are. So what he did was, he took every single SAT results and every single student of every state school in the entire country and compared that to the teacher assessments. Now their teacher assessments, your teacher obviously does know what you look like and does know your ethnicity. He found on average, across the board, where he looked at every single state school in the entire country, he found that overwhelmingly, white students did far better on their teacher assessments than on their SAT results. And conversely, black students did far better on their SAT results than on their teacher assessments. And then he did the exact same thing, but he looked at year 10 students. When you're about to take, I don't know if people remember, when you're taking GCSEs, you can either do higher or foundation, right? And if you do higher, the highest you can get is an A star. If you do foundation, the highest you can get is a C. So what he did was, he controlled for every factor. Obviously he controlled for prior academic attainments, but he also controlled for loads of class issues. So whether they were on free school meals, whether their parents were still together, whether their parents owned their own home. All of these different things to account for class. And he still found across the board, you're far more likely to be put in for a higher tier if you're white, and far more likely to be put in for a foundation tier if you're black. So again, there's a lot of issues around employment, education, as well as housing, and of course we're all familiar with the issues around employment as well. That's something that we're all very concerned about, and study after study finds the exact same thing. You can send in identical CVs, send one with a foreign sounding name in, we know which one is more likely to receive an interview. I guess my name's Adam Elliott Cooper, so I might make it to the interview stage at least. Okay, so I guess I started on quite a doom and gloomy kind of points, but there's a huge amount that black communities in particular are doing to resist these types of issues. The kind of issues that I'm most familiar with are the ones around the criminal justice system and policing. So one of the organisations I work with is the Tottenham Defence Campaign. Some of them were involved in some of the protests you can see here behind me. And they were first formed in 1985 after what were called the Broadwater Farm riots. These were some riots that took place on a council estate in Broadwater Farm in Tottenham, and it was after a police officer was killed during some riots that took place where loads and loads of police came in. There was a lot of violence, and a police officer was killed. And as you can imagine, after that, there were huge raids. Lots of raids on houses, lots of raids on different people's homes in the local area, lots of arrests. You had the newspapers calling these people animals, calling them apes, calling Broadwater Farm a jungle. So a lot of kind of the racialised language that we're kind of familiar with, overt racialised language we're familiar with. And you had a lot of people who were charged on very trumped up charges who eventually found that a lot of the evidence was fabricated, and in the end everyone who was charged with the murder of PC Blakelock ended up getting off because there wasn't enough evidence. Similarly, in fact, the two black residents on Broadwater Farm who were killed by the police, two women during the raids of their homes, no police were charged for their deaths either. And so after the 2011 riots, after the killing of Mark Duggan, the Tottenham Defence Campaign was reformed. Because what you saw during the end of August 2011 going into September 2011 was, again, huge numbers of raids, huge numbers of arrests, huge numbers of stops and searches. You saw over 1,000 people be put in jail for a very long period of time. You saw people going to jail for silly things like stealing a bottle of water. There was a man who died in jail just 3 months ago who was put into prison during the 2011 riots for stealing a gingerbread man. So you can see that. So as you can imagine, this was although there's a lot of institutional racism, and there's a very the way in which the black community has to engage with the criminal justice system is obviously very, very difficult. In the aftermath of the 2011 riots, this was even more intense and something the community really had to build around. So what did they do? There was a big community meeting that came together. And you had a lot of different people from a lot of different kind of political persuasions. You had kind of Pan-Africanists, cultural nationalists, and Dashikis. You had people from the anti-racist movement. You had quite critical youth workers. You had people from the socialist parties. You had white anarchist groups. Loads of different people come together. But what happened was at this point, people realised that people had to kind of put their kind of political ideologies aside for a while and work to resist the police in order to stop an entire generation of young people from being incarcerated. So you had bust cards set out, given out, where you had what to do if you're stopped, what to do if you're searched, what to do if you're arrested, what to do if your house is raided, what to do if the police ask you to come in for a friendly chat at the police station, which usually ends up in you incriminating yourself in some way and being arrested. And then leafleting every single house on the estate, and then going to the next estate and doing the exact same thing until there was kind of a blanket saturation of the entire estate, so everyone had good legal representation, access to good legal representation, and good legal knowledge, so they could at least know what to do kind of in the immediate aftermath of these types of things. We also ran a lot of education workshops with young people, so they were aware of what to do if the police tried to stop them, search them, arrest them, harass them, what have you. And one of the main ways in which we kind of articulate it is that a lot of women that we know, especially when they're on their own, have to constantly be vigilant and constantly be wary of the fact that they may be a victim of violence, of gender-based violence. And we encourage people, particularly within the black community, to try to exercise that same kind of vigilance when in relation to the police. So at any point in time, you could be a victim of police violence. At any point in time, you could be a victim of police harassment, police intimidation. And it's something which, since on average 1 person a week dies in police custody in this country, it is something that your life could depend on. And so we make sure that whenever that people are approached by a police officer, one of the first things that they do is they turn on the record thing on their phone, so that they can at least record exactly what's happening. There's a software app you can get on any smartphone, which is called Ustream. That means that once something is recording, it records straight onto a live server, not onto the memory of your phone. So if the police grab your phone, smash it to pieces, nothing that had been recorded up until that point can be deleted. So you can use that in 2 ways. You can use that, of course, in that exact situation so that the abuse can be recorded, or you can hold it up to them and tell them this is being recorded on a live stream. Everything that you've done has been recorded, and there's no way that you can delete it, and it will continue to record until you stop what you're doing right now. So there's a number of different ways in which you can use kind of technology and different things like that in order to try to resist the kind of violence around policing that people were familiar with and that people were experiencing. And I think one of the ways in which this kind of form of policing is kind of supported is through the kind of government rhetoric which isn't as overtly racist as the kind of stuff we see around the English defence and gang culture. A week ago, during the inquiry of Mark Duggan, the Evening Standard, the London newspaper, the Evening Standard, ran a whole cover piece on gangs of London. And what you saw on the front covers were black bodies. When people think about the word gang, they don't say black people, but it's a racialised term, and when they say gang, they're talking about black people. And so that gave the police a kind of green light to kind of engage in the kind of violent acts that they did engage in the months following August 2011. So when we hear the English Defence League say they want a war on Islam, we also hear the government say they want to do a war on terror and war on gangs. So although the overt racism of the English Defence League makes our blood boil, and rightly so, I think it's important that it doesn't distract us from the far more damaging and powerful institutional and structural racial violence of the state, where we don't necessarily get called the N-word or anything like that, but they have a far more dangerous form of racism where they tell us that multiculturalism has failed. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Adam. I thought it was really interesting. I just wanted to raise a couple of points. In terms of educational inequality, there's a lot of work, obviously, that we're doing in terms of, as Black Students Campaign, as NUS, in order to work on that and challenge it. There was a very good report, and I recommend you read it, that was produced by the Black Students Campaign called Race for Equality, which contains many recommendations about what you can do to challenge institutional racism in your college and your universities. Another thing was that there's a famous, it's Black History Month, let's get quoting some great people. Martin Luther King said about how riots were the voice of the unheard. So I think that we have to be very, very clear on our government, what they're like. Yeah, so I have to be very, very clear on exactly what government is doing. It is actually trying to demonise black communities, and we should be very, very clear about that. And how long did it take as well, Doreen Lawrence, to get some justice for her son being killed and a massive police cover-up, 18 years too many, and obviously still at large. Okay, so without further anymore, I'm going to go to our next speaker, Joe Niner, who is author of Driven by the Movement.
Actually, Lorenzo's going to go first.
Right, okay, we're changing it up, that's good. So, the next speaker is Lorenzo Irvin, who is author of Anarchism and the Black Revolution, The Progressive Plantation, and Black Power, Black Autonomy, who is an ex-Civil Rights and Black Panther Party member, who will speak on his years as civil rights, Black Power activist, a black anarchist political prisoner, and a contemporary anti-racist organiser. So let's give a massive round of applause.
Can you hear me clearly in all parts of the room? I don't have to scream at you. I told my wife when we started off, we've been doing a tour for about, 8, 9, 10 days now, I don't know. And we've been to a lot of places. And I said, this might be the night when my ass is in one place and my brain is in another. And if that is the case, you know, I apologize in advance. But we've been doing this tour for about a little while now, and it's been very intense. We've been going from one city, we'll pop into one city and pop out the next day and go into another, and we've got to do this for 3 weeks. But it's also been very enriching in that we've had pretty good participation everywhere we've gone. We've met a lot of really good activists. We've met a lot of black people with something on their minds, which is a rarity these days, to be quite honest. And we have also been able to share our individual histories in the civil rights, in my case, and Black Power movements, and the Black Panther Party, which is part of that, and also to enrich and share culturally. And we think that this is an extremely important thing. Is this thing going to be after me all night long? It's probably the police trying to get an interview, want to know how I got through airport security or something. Later, buddy. You know, anyway, it was really important. It's really important that we have meetings like this. It's really important that we have months like this to celebrate our people's survival, celebrate our people's achievement, and then give ourselves challenges and tasks to go forward. This is real important. Otherwise, we just go through the motions. We still got chains on us, and we're doing nothing about it. That's what it amounts to. So we really got to motivate ourselves to put ourselves forward, to understand that although this is a different historical period, we have to fight those people and this system that is oppressing us, just as Adam was saying. And I thought he did a very good job in laying out some of the contemporary things in the UK, which is, by the way, very similar to the contemporary things that are happening right now in the United States with massive police brutality, massive black infant mortality, police brutality, massive unemployment, massive oppression. You know, so it's very similar. It looks like it's a one program to continue a long history of oppression and train of abuses against our peoples. So in that respect, we think it's real important. Now, I want to talk to you briefly and then bring up what I always call the main hitter here, the heavy hitter. We want to talk about the Black Panther Party, but how we got to the Black Panther Party. People say, oh, we'll get to the Black Panther Party, man. We want to hear about the guns. No, you won't hear about that. You'll hear about guns, but first of all, you got to hear about how all of this developed. And it's important to understand how all of this developed, because then you'll kind of understand why it is so difficult in this period now to build another Black Panther Party, even though numerous groups have tried. There's been something like 17 groups in the United States that have tried to build new Black Panther parties, and all of them have failed dismally in our estimation, and in the estimation of the mass of people as well. They failed dismally. And they failed dismally because they weren't able to create a program, and they also weren't part of a continuing mass movement from the period of the Civil Rights Movement into then what became the Black Power Movement, and later the founding of the Black Panther Party, which was the most militant wing of the Black Power Movement. And just like everything else, there was always a wing, two wings, at least two wings of a movement. One wing of the Civil Rights Movement, which began in 1955 with Dr. Martin Luther King and the adult leadership. And these adult leaders had this Montgomery bus boycott, and Dr. King came to prominence and all this. We know about all of this, or at least we have a real working understanding of it. We don't have as much of a working understanding in thinking about that there was a youth wing of the Civil Rights Movement, which was totally distinct from Dr. King, or didn't take orders from Dr. King. In fact, didn't take orders from anybody but the mass of people themselves. And this movement, of which I was a part, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and let me point out that the student movement has always been extremely powerful and important in making black social changes ever since that period of 1960. That was a critical year in that was the year that the sit-in movement started. That was the year that 4 young black men went to a lunch counter in North Carolina, in I think it was Greensboro, North Carolina, and they sat in and demanded to be served in a circumstance where there had been years of racial segregation. In fact, racial segregation was the law, and the southern states, 16 or so southern states, protected this kind of racial discrimination. And so they came in and they demanded that they be served. And of course, the white folks didn't serve them, but it threw them into a serious pickle because they couldn't understand what these black people were doing down here anyway. And the black people wouldn't leave. They cussed at them, would throw things at them or whatever, and they wouldn't leave. And so this first day of this protest, all things considered, went pretty well. They were still alive at the end of it. And then the next day and days following this, more and more students got involved in this particular tactic of a sit-in. Now the white folks claim that all Occupy movement and all this stuff, this had started last year or something. Well, the sit-ins were the actual first Occupy movements. They went in and demanded to be served, and they stayed there all day. And just as a really simple and basic tactic, if you look at it in 2013, but if you look at it now, you don't necessarily have an understanding that in those days, in that period of segregation, you had no rights that the white government or white people were bound to respect, including the right to life. They could have been killed, murdered, and nobody would have done a thing about it, to be quite honest. Nobody would have cared, and nobody would have done a thing about it. They said, well, these crazy Negroes were down there fooling with the white folks. They should have stayed in their place and done what the white folks told them. That's the way people thought then. In fact, there were black people coming up to them saying, well, what are you all doing here? Why are you here causing trouble? The plantation mentality. This is what it was, the plantation mentality. And it was a mentality of long standing. But these students were not stopped by this, and they were not intimidated by it, and so they kept on coming until eventually they overwhelmed these facilities, these places that were engaging in racial discrimination, and they were able to.
It's interesting that we're here today. Today, I believe, today's October the 14th, is that correct?
Yeah.
So tomorrow, October 15th, will mark the 47th anniversary of the founding of the Black Panther Party. It was founded on October 15th, 1966 in Oakland, California. An organization that which I later joined, and of course Lorenzo was also a member. The Black Panther Party was started by two black college students, Huey Newton and Bobby Seale. Huey was about 24, 25 years old. Bobby Seale was about 30. And they were influenced by the Black Power movement. They were influenced by the kind of things that were being done in the group that Lorenzo was talking about, that he was active in, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And they also saw what was going on around the United States. And one of the things that they saw where they lived in Oakland, California, was a rise in police brutality. Oakland, at that time, in the late 1960s, in the whole, what we call the San Francisco Bay Area, which includes Oakland, you had a lot of companies coming there, kind of like the wartime. World War II was over, but during the war, a lot of military plants were, building things for the war, World War II, and then after that, the Korean War. And Huey's father brought his wife and their children from Louisiana to California to work in those plants. Bobby Seale's father, and his wife brought Bobby Seale and his brothers and sisters to Oakland. So they neither one of them was born there. They came from the South, but their families came there to seek a better life and to work in the the military plants, making whatever they made. So at this time, there was, as Lorenzo mentioned, black people were beginning to protest against police brutality. There were many rebellions in many cities throughout the United States, black rebellions, and most of those rebellions started over the incidents of police brutality. Huey and Bobby said black people have got to defend themselves against this police brutality, and so what they did, they came together and formed the Black Panther Party for self-defense. Now, the Black Panther Party had a 10-point platform and program. But in the early stages, it was point number 7 that they kind of focused on. Point number 7 was calling for black people to form armed self-defense groups to fight police brutality or any other kind of brutality or repression from the state. And this was something that, you know, they were inspired to do this. They studied the example of a leader of the NAACP in the United States, the NAACP, National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the oldest civil rights organization in the United States. And in the state of North Carolina, Robert Williams and his wife, Mabel, led an NAACP chapter in North Carolina, and they armed themselves to fight the Klan in North Carolina. And they did this a good 10 years before the Black Panther Party. But Huey Newton and Bobby Seale knew about this. They had studied what Robert Williams and Mabel Williams had done in taking up arms to fight the Klan. And they said that black people have got to start doing this. So what they started doing was they organized armed patrols, community patrols of the police. And at that time in the state of California, it was legal for anybody to have a gun. They changed the law later, but at that time, you know, if you were at least 18 years old, you could walk around the streets with a gun. It was legal. And they started these armed patrols of the police. And what they would do, they would go around the black community primarily, and they would observe incidents where the police were harassing people. And it was usually black people beating black people, and they would advise them. Huey wrote this kind of little pocket guide, a legal guide for black people to know what their rights were. And the Black Panthers would observe what was happening. They would tell the police are violating your rights. They don't have a right to do this. And of course, you can imagine that this did not go over well with the police department. They were not used to, you know, black people, especially a group of armed young black people. And these were basically young black people, telling them, interfering with their beating up people in the community. So the politicians in California, they obviously had to figure out a way to stop this. You have to remember, this was unheard of. Obviously, Robert Williams had done it 10 years earlier, but Huey Newton and Bobby Seale took it to a different level. They actually went out in the streets, and when people were being beaten and harassed, and told people what their rights were. So the government in the state of California had to make a move against that. So they proposed legislation that would outlaw people being able to carry guns like they used to be able to carry guns. They said, we have to change the law. And so when they were debating this change in the law in the California legislature, state legislature, a group of Black Panthers led by Bobby Seale, Huey Newton didn't go to this particular thing because they thought that there might be, they figured they would be arrested, and they didn't want both of the leaders to be arrested. So Huey didn't go. With Bobby Seale and other Black Panthers, including women, if you look at some of the pictures of this, it happened in May of 1967. They stormed into the California legislature to protest this legislation. They were armed with guns. Up until this point, the Black Panther Party was primarily just known in Northern California, Oakland, San Francisco, that area. But this made national news. These young black people bursting into the halls of a state legislative body, interrupting their debate on this legislation. You saw these young black people with guns. This terrorized many white people in the United States, obviously, but it inspired a lot of young black people who saw it. And they said, wow, this is great. Black people are standing up for our rights. So at this is the point at which the Black Panther Party began to grow outside of Oakland, California. It started in Oakland, California, so we had chapters and branches developed in other parts of the country: Chicago, Seattle, Washington, New York, Atlanta, Georgia, Dallas, Texas, other parts of the country. Now, at the time that this happened, when the Black Panthers went into the California legislature, I was finishing my, ultimately, a school that the first kids that came there were supposed to be kids who were too stupid to learn, but ultimately the Oakland Community School received an award from the legislature of the state of California for having achieved a really high standard and such great success in teaching those young kids, you know, kids that were supposed to be too stupid. In fact, our kids had better results on the state test than the public school kids had on it. So we just had our motto was each one teach one. So we had better luck, and that was one of our more successful programs. I'm going to mention a couple of others, and then I'll be quiet so we can have more discussion, questions, and answers. We also had a busing to prisons program. At that time, we had a lot of black people who were going to prisons and jails, and of course, it's worse now. I know you have a similar problem here in the UK, but many of the people whose family members were in prisons or jails, especially the prisons, because they were located far away from the communities where the prisoners were from. And a lot of people did not have cars, and they didn't necessarily have money to buy a bus ticket to go visit their loved ones. So the Black Panther Party started what we call the free busing to prisons program. Now in some cities they actually had a bus, but where I joined the Black Panther Party in Detroit, Michigan, we didn't have a bus, but we had cars. And that's one of the things I used to help do. We would drive family members to the Michigan State Prison. It was a huge, at that time it was one of the biggest prisons in the United States. We would drive people up to the state prison. I think we did this once a month to visit their loved ones who were, you know, in prison. And it's very important for prisoners to be able to stay in contact with their families. It kind of helps them keep their hope alive, you know. And if they had, you know, sometimes people would go to jail and prison leaving children behind. They could get to see their kids every now and then. So that was another one of our survival programs, because we understood that it was important for people in our communities who were incarcerated to maintain those family ties. And we also had a program for senior citizens. We called it Seniors Against a Fearful Environment. We provided escorts for senior citizens when they went to the banks to cash their checks. In those days, you got a check in the mail. We didn't have direct deposit back then. You know, you got a paper check, and you had to go to the bank and deposit it. And sometimes the senior citizens would get arrested. They wouldn't get arrested, they would get robbed. So we provided an escort service for them to protect them from getting robbed. And we also took them to their appointments. If they didn't have a car, they needed to go to the doctor or the dentist, we would pick them up and give them a ride to the doctor or the dentist. So these were some of our survival programs. And the last thing I want to say, you know, about the Black Panther Party, at least right now, is that the entire Black Power movement, but it hit the Black Panther Party the worst. The federal government, the FBI, devised a program to destroy the entire Black Power movement. They were scared of the Black Power movement because there were all these black youth involved, and they were afraid of what would happen if black youth got involved in really radical revolutionary activity. So the FBI started a counterintelligence program. They sent spies into the Black Power movement to spy on people, you know, agent provocateurs, whatever you want to call them, informants. And we found out as a result of some people breaking into an FBI office in the state of California and liberating some files. We found out about the counterintelligence program, and we found out that out of all the actions of the FBI counterintelligence program carried out against the Black Power movement, 95% of those actions that took place between 1969 and 1971, 95% of those were carried out against the Black Panther Party. The Black Panther Party received the brunt of the repression of the government in terms of the whole Black Power movement, because we fed hungry kids, right? And we helped senior citizens go to the bank and cash their checks. But we received the brunt of it. And today we still have people who were Black Panthers, people who are my age. I'm 65 years old. I've got old Black Panther comrades who who are my age today who've been in prison 35, 40 years because they were Black Panthers, and because the government doesn't want to let them out because they're afraid of the influence they may have on young people today. I'm going to stop here. We're going to have questions and answers and discussion. Thank you very much.